We like to think of our workplaces as these super rational, logical spaces. But what if the most powerful forces shaping our day to day are, well, completely invisible? In this explainer, we're going to pull back the curtain on the hidden emotional currents that truly define our work lives.
So let's just start with a really simple question. Think about your last week at work. Were your decisions, your interactions, driven purely by data and logic? Or was there something else going on? Maybe a little bit of frustration, a spark of excitement with a colleague, maybe some anxiety about a deadline? For so long, the prevailing wisdom has been that the workplace is this perfectly rational machine. It's a place where we're supposed to solve problems with cold, hard logic, and we're just expected to check our feelings at the door. Kind of like hanging your coat in an emotional cloakroom before you clock in. But let's be real. That's just not how it works, is it? Anyone who's been on a high-stakes team project or had a tough talk with a manager knows that reality is way messier. Our work lives are just simmering with emotion, from the high of a big win to the quiet frustration of hitting a roadblock. Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to break down two really critical types of emotion on the job. Then we'll see how feelings shape our relationships at work, look at the serious dangers of burnout, and then, the good part, figure out how communication can be our best way to cope. So to really get a handle on all this, we first need to understand the huge difference between emotional labor and emotional work. Yeah, they sound almost the same, but trust me, they represent two totally different demands on us. First up, we've got emotional labor. This is a term from the sociologist Arlie Hochschild, and it's for jobs where you are literally expected to perform certain feelings as part of the role. Think about flight attendants, baristas, call center folks. You're getting paid not just for what you do, but for the smile you put on while you do it. And this quote from a real employee handbook. Wow, it says it all, right? Your troubles should be masked with a smile. That is emotional labor in black and white. It's an inauthentic performance, an act that's required by the company, all for the benefit of the bottom line. And this brings us to the really crucial distinction. On one side, you've got that performed emotion of the flight attendant. That's emotional labor. But on the other side, you've got emotional work. These are the genuine feelings that just come up naturally as part of a profession. Think of a teacher's real joy when a student finally has that aha moment. That isn't an act. It's an authentic, real part of doing the job. So emotion at work isn't just something dictated from on high. It also bubbles up, and powerfully, from our everyday interactions with the people we work with, side by side. And the research on this is so clear. When you ask people to talk about their feelings at work, they almost never talk about the tasks they're doing. They talk about their boss, their team, their colleagues. Our emotional lives at work are, at their very core, social. And these relationships can create this huge spectrum of feelings. On one end, you've got compassion, that supportive culture that's built through all those small, everyday conversations. But on the other end of the spectrum, you have the absolutely devastating impact of workplace bullying, which can just shatter a person's confidence and their belief in fairness. So, what happens when that constant pressure of performing emotions, of navigating these stressful relationships, what happens when it all becomes too much? Well, that's when we start to enter the really dangerous territory of burnout. You can actually map this out in 3 basic steps. It starts with stressors in the environment, things like a crushing workload or not being sure what your role is. These stressors then lead to the strain we call burnout. And that burnout, well, that leads to a whole cascade of negative outcomes for the person and for the whole organization. And burnout isn't just feeling tired. It's way more specific. Researchers define it by 3 key dimensions. First, there's emotional exhaustion, that core feeling of just being completely and utterly drained. Second, depersonalization, where you start to develop a really cynical, detached view of your job or the people you're supposed to help. And third, a lack of personal accomplishment, which is that awful, crushing feeling that you're just not effective anymore. This all leads to a really fascinating and, honestly, kind of counterintuitive question. We're always told to be more empathetic, right? But could being too empathetic actually be a bad thing? Well, when it comes to burnout, the answer is a surprising yes. It all depends on the type of empathy you're using. Okay, check this out. On the left is emotional contagion. This is feeling with someone. You absorb their sadness, their anxiety like a sponge. This path leads straight to burnout. But on the right, you have empathic concern. This is feeling for someone. You can be caring and supporting without taking on their emotional state as your own. And this is the path that actually protects you.
Okay, so we've looked at how emotion and stress can really wear us down. But the good news is that communication is also our most powerful tool for coping and building ourselves back up. So how do we actually do it? One of the most effective strategies is surprisingly simple: increasing participation in decision-making, or PDM. I mean, when people have a real voice in the things that affect them, it directly fights those big stressors. It makes their roles clearer, it gives them a sense of control, and it shows them they're valued. It's a really powerful antidote to feeling helpless. The second huge communication strategy is building and using social support. And this isn't just about venting, It's about strategically creating a buffer against stress by leaning on the right people in our lives, both at work and at home. We can get three main types of support. First, there's emotional support, having a shoulder to cry on. That usually comes from our coworkers and our family. Then there's informational support, getting advice or help with a problem. We typically get that from bosses and peers. And finally, instrumental support is actual tangible help, like a boss moving a deadline or a family member helping out with chores. The trick is knowing what you need and who's in the best position to give it. All right, let's wrap this up and bring it all together. What have we really learned today about the hidden life of emotion at work? So, we started by totally shattering that myth of the rational workplace. We learned the difference between the performance of emotional labor and the genuine experience of emotional work. We saw that our relationships are the real engine of how we feel at work, how that can all lead to burnout, and most importantly, how communication is our absolute best way to cope. And that really leaves us with one final and I think really important question. The goal isn't to get rid of emotion at work. That's totally impossible, and honestly, we wouldn't want to. The real challenge is to create organizations that actually acknowledge our emotional lives and build systems that support our whole human selves. So how do we build those kinds of workplaces? Thank you so much for joining this explainer. I really hope it gives you a new lens for seeing those invisible but incredibly powerful emotional currents in your own workplace.